Colditz is absolutely buried in our national mythology. I mean, it is a proper noun in itself. This place feels like a Colditz. Everyone knows what you mean. And the story is familiar to us, we think. It's a story of brave British men with moustaches, digging their way out of this sort of huge Gothic castle and generally sort of keeping the fight going inside. That's what the board game is about. That's what the black and white TV series is about. But actually, the story of Colditz turned out to be very, very different from that.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. My name is Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor and your host. Today's podcast is a fascinating chat with Ben Macintyre on his new book, Colditz, and then also, towards the end of our discussion, I'll ask him a number of questions about his previous books, in particular about his work on the KGB spy Oleg Gordievsky, and then the Cambridge spy Kim Philby. Now, we heard last week about Christopher Marlowe, the Tudor playwright, who was probably a spy whilst at Cambridge, and so the university has previous. Oleg Gordievsky is the subject of Ben's book, The Spy and the Traitor. This is the brilliant story of a man who can make the claim to have changed history. Now, there is a strong opinion by some that espionage doesn't really change policy, fascinating though it is, but in Gordievsky's case, that is categorically not the case. Kim Philby rose to senior positions at MI6, where he worked for more than 20 years, and it was only in January 1963 that he was finally unmasked as a Soviet agent. He was an archetype of the establishment. Born in the Raj, British India, educated at public school, Westminster, and Cambridge University. Philby's exposure as a double agent working for the Russians sent shockwaves through the British establishment, and caused serious harm to the relationship between the British and the American intelligence agencies. His treachery and defection has since inspired many books and movies, and if any of you have not yet read John le Carré's novel Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, do so now. The link is in the show notes. Ben Macintyre wrote a wonderful book about Philby and his seemingly great friend Nicholas Elliot entitled A Spy Among Friends, so that comes recommended also. That's just a bit of context for those of you who are unaware. We also briefly mentioned the Hollywood movie Operation Mincemeat, based on Ben's book, which is the story of how the British fooled the Germans into thinking the invasion of Sicily in World War II would actually take place elsewhere, by planting a dead body on the shores of the Spanish coast, where it would be found containing fake documents to put the Nazis off the scent. Anyway, before all that, we talk about Colditz, where the Germans sent those POWs that were the most troublesome. It's a story that may be familiar, as you heard from Ben there, but in writing his new book, Ben has found new stories that were hiding in plain sight. So I do hope you enjoy our chat. Please do subscribe, and I'll hand you over to me, talking to Ben Macintyre. Ben Macintyre, welcome to the Aspects of History podcast.
Great pleasure to be here.
Now, actually, I don't know if I should be welcoming you because I'm in the offices of Penguin. But thank you for your time, and we're here to talk about your new book, Colditz. I'm assuming that's the title because I've only seen a PDF.
The full title is Colditz: Prisoners of the Castle.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's that's the new one.
Wonderful. Okay, so I've read it, and it's. I hadn't read the story in great detail. I'd watched the TV series, I think, from the 70s and played the board game with my dad. But it's an even more extraordinary story in the book than I'd imagined. But I think the way you've done it's very interesting. And I wanted to talk about sort of the two main themes I got coming out of the book. And the first is the reason why they're all there. And it's the I'm gonna have a go at German. The Deutschfeindlich.
Yeah,
have I got that right?
Yeah.
So this is being insufficiently friendly to the Nazis, who are not known to be friendly themselves.
But it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, only the Germans would come up with a word for insufficient friendliness. I mean, it's and I'm slightly parodying them there. Yes, I mean that Colditz was the place for people who other prisoners who had either tried to escape from other prison camps or who had made themselves so intolerable that the Germans felt they had to move them all into one place. It turned out to be a spectacularly bad idea, because if you put all the bad boys together in one camp, they behave extremely badly and they egg each other on. And that's what gave Colditz, in a way, its very particular atmosphere, was that these were almost hand-picked by the Germans for their recalcitrance, which of course makes them fascinating characters. But no, to address your first question, I mean, I approached this project with some trepidation, because Colditz is absolutely buried in our national mythology. I mean, it is a proper noun in itself. You know, this place feels like a Colditz. Everyone knows what you mean. And the story is familiar to us, we think. It's a story of brave British men with moustaches, you know, digging their way out of this sort of huge Gothic castle and generally sort of keeping the fight going inside. That's what the board game is about. That's what the black and white TV series is about. But actually, the story of Colditz turned out to be very, very different from that. It's not a story. I mean, it is partly a story of daring do. It is partly a sort of boys' own paper, sort of japes, and it's all the game. But actually, there's a much darker, a much more interesting story to Colditz. It turns out on digging, and there hasn't been a book about Colditz for 20 years, and our own perceptions of history have changed radically in the last 20 years. And the real story of Colditz, I found, was about class and race and sexuality and a particular kind of madness. Because if you lock people up for 5 years with absolutely no idea whether they're ever going to get out, a particular kind of lunacy sort of takes hold. And what they did inside Colditz was to sort of recreate the world that they'd come from. These were upper middle class, usually public school educated, white middle class men. And they recreated a kind of interwar world inside Colditz, complete with theatrical performances and bridge clubs and societies and exclusive. I mean, it was incredibly socially stratified, Colditz. There was even, believe it or not, a Bullingdon club in Colditz, which was one of the most bizarre discoveries, was that even inside Colditz, there was a kind of rigid social stratification going on.
And there were we can deal with class straight away then, because the Bullingdon club that they set up, and they actually call it the Bullingdon Club, don't they?
Yeah, they have their own mess. I mean, and you had to have been a member of the Bullingdon Club.
It's extraordinary. But there are also a couple of communists there. And I was reading it thinking, if there was going to be one thing to turn me over to communism, it would be a Bullingdon Club in a prisoner of war camp.
Well, I found that fascinating too. And also, slightly contradicting what I've just said, external factors were influencing life inside Colditz. So you had, in a way, the battle between the communists, and there were people of the extreme right in Colditz too. Believe me, I mean, there were some, I'm afraid, particularly among the French, there were some ferocious anti-Semites. There were Pétainists. There were people who were, sympathetic to the right. And so you have this kind of ideological battle, in a way, taking place inside Colditz that prefigures the Cold War. That prefigures the war itself. So you've got a kind of rolling political debate going at the same time, which is fascinating. And of course, these are, most of them, well-educated people. They are people used to dealing with ideas. So you've got a kind of an intellectual sort of conflict taking place inside the prison walls, as well as this class conflict going on. And there is a conflict among the classes. I mean, again, something that I had never realized, and you'd never have got from the board game, was that although this was an officers' prison, this was a place where officers, and that's hence they had certain privileges, but it was the officers themselves under the Geneva Convention had ordinary soldiers, privates, also prisoners, to work for them. They had servants. So people to polish their boots and clean out their rooms and cook their food. So you had this extraordinary kind of social chasm running right through the middle of Colditz, right from the word go. And at one point, the orderlies, as they were known, the ordinary prisoners who were looking after the officers, went on strike, said, we're not doing this anymore. We're not going to continue looking after the officers.
They would only take orders from the Germans,
I was laughing out loud. It's extraordinary, isn't it? But again, it's a sign of how the sort of the sort of things that were happening in the outside world, the growth of of the left, the sort of socialist ideas, the growth of unionism, if you like, were also infiltrating into Colditz. And I found that utterly fascinating. I mean, the revolt, the rebellion of the orderlies, as they called it, was put down pretty quickly, and the orderlies were moved out. And of course, the orderlies were not allowed to escape. That was another element of it. They were not permitted to try to get out. And indeed, even when they were swapped out towards in the middle part of the war, there was a program to exchange ordinary prisoners from each side. Douglas Bader, the most famous occupant of Colditz, refused to let his orderly go home. Said, "No, you're not. You're staying here. You're my lackey."
Is it that is because he comes out of this as a deeply unpleasant man.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have much time for Douglas Bader. I mean, although I was sort of conflicted about him. I mean, in lots of ways, he was a complete bastard. I mean, he was brutally cruel to his orderlies. He was arrogant. He was very difficult to deal with. He was, on the other hand, spectacularly brave, and in later life did a huge amount for people with disabilities, as your listeners will know. He lost both his legs in a flying accident. He was the most famous soldier, really, of the entire Second World War. He was almost as famous among the Germans as he was with the British. And he was shot down, lost one of his prosthetic legs bailing out of the plane before he was captured by the Germans. And this is a mark of just how famous he was. The Germans then contacted British intelligence and said, Douglas Bader needs another leg. So the British actually flew out and parachuted in an extra false leg for Douglas Bader in an operation called, with a fantastic lack of originality, called Operation Leg.
The class side of things and the final word that Bader has to his orderly, which I won't repeat,
is unprintable.
It is unprintable
in a family program.
When reading that, I was thinking, what a shame it wasn't reversed the other way around. That would have been far better. But anyway,
well, he got his revenge, Alex Ross, who was Bader's orderly, because one of the great resources for the Colditz story is in the Imperial War Museum, which contains thousands of hours of recordings made in the late 80s and early 90s. Pretty much everybody who'd been in Colditz was interviewed by the Imperial War Museum, and it's the most wonderful repository. And Alex Ross's recording is in there, and that's when he gets his revenge on Bader. That's where all of that, where you really learn about what that relationship was really like. Yes, and that the final moment is quite an eye-opener.
So you mentioned race, and there's one individual there who is an Indian nationalist, who sounds like a fascinating character, but really had a lot of bad luck and was treated terribly, wasn't he?
He was treated very badly. He was the only non-white soldier in Colditz, and his story has never been told, I think, I'm afraid, because he doesn't fit into our mythology of Colditz. And he was an extraordinary man, Birendranath Mazumdar. He was the only Indian officer in the Royal Army Medical Corps. He was captured at Dunkirk, taken to Colditz, where, as you rightly say, he suffered appalling racism, but not from the Germans, from the British. I mean, he was treated absolutely as a second-class citizen, mocked, told he wasn't allowed to escape because his skin was the wrong colour. He'd have been picked up immediately, which might have been true, actually, but it was nonetheless an astonishingly racist thing to insist on. And his story is quite remarkable. I don't want to give it away too much, but it's a story of remarkable heroism, actually. And he gets out. I don't want to give it all away about how he did it, but it's one of the many untold stories of Colditz. And who would have known it after all this time that there are, but it's true of often this kind of area of history that the mythology that we inherited, the sort of black and white stories, the Sunday afternoon TV film Dam Busters and The Great Escape and so on, they all follow a sort of certain template, that this is a story of simple moral black and white, goodies and baddies, heroes and villains, and there's not much in between. Of course, what Colditz asks is the question of what would you do? Because the whole of human nature is in there, and there are people of astonishing heroism and integrity and ingenuity, and there are others more like me and others who are sort of somewhere in the middle. They're trying to do the best thing, most of them, and some do the wrong thing. There are traitors, there are quislings in there. We are all made of human clay, and the idea that somehow everybody in Colditz was a born hero with a bristling moustache is not true.
Well, there's one chap who I'm not sure if I was meant to have sympathy for, but I did, and that is the main jailer Eggers, who I really warmed to throughout the book, and I don't think the British did.
No, he was an extraordinary character. I mean, he ended up as sort of head of security at Colditz, so he was responsible for trying to stop them escape, and he was also he was an Anglophile, which is so extraordinary. He'd been a teacher in Cheltenham before the war, and he loved the British, and he was, he loved British beer, and he did his thesis on Victorian schooling. I mean, he was sort of extraordinary figure, really, and he was the one who collected all the artefacts of Colditz. So he was really the archivist of Colditz as well, and he was fascinated by their attempts to escape. He was very punctilious, but he was also a very civilized man. He was not a Nazi.
He never joined the Nazi Party.
Never joined the Nazi Party, but he was a German nationalist. He wanted to win the war, but he was an old-fashioned Prussian military professional, really, in lots of ways. So he doesn't fit our sort of. There were lots of unpleasant Nazis in the officers' mess in Colditz. Don't get me wrong; they weren't all saints, and nor was Eggers. But he nonetheless was a man who tried to work by the rules, and he tried to apply the Geneva Convention. And the Brits sort of treated him with withering disdain and tried to get him to lose his temper the whole time. And he'd been a schoolteacher, so he believed he was able to deal with the unruly elements. And like all sort of slightly pompous schoolteachers, he was often wise after the event. But in the end, he was a decent man who ended up spending 10 years in a Soviet gulag, a Soviet prison camp, because he was considered to have been a Nazi, which he wasn't. So he spent longer as a prisoner than any of the prisoners that were ever in his care. So he's an interestingly complicated character. And I too ended up feeling a certain sort of slightly resentful sympathy for him.
He's constantly disappointed by the British and the Dutch in his charge. The Dutch are sort of polite, but then they let themselves down.
They let themselves down. They did that thing, they let the school down,
yes.
They let their team down, but most of all, they let themselves down. No, the Dutch appeared to be very polite while escaping all the time. The Brits, he couldn't get over the fact that the Brits inside Colditz were so much ruder than the lovely people he'd known in Cheltenham, who'd all been tremendously polite and inviting him for beers and so on. And he just couldn't get over how mean they were, really.
So one, the mental health which you've mentioned it runs throughout the book, really, and it does make you think that for all the escapes that were successful, many were not, and just the toll that it took on the prisoners. I mean, it's tragic in some cases, isn't it? It just doesn't bear thinking about life.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting sort of it's a particular sort of imprisonment. I mean, in some ways, because it was an officers' camp, there were certain elements of it that were much more comfortable than they would have been in an ordinary stalag, for example. And yet, it was a prison without end, because nobody ever knew when or if they were ever going to get out of it. I mean, if you're a prisoner in an ordinary prison, you have a sentence, and you can count down the sentence, and you know that at some point you're going to be liberated. These people had no idea whether they would ever be liberated or whether they would all just be murdered in the end. So that adds an extra element to it. And it was fantastically boring, because, I mean, again, that's rather against the myth of Colditz, which is frightfully entertaining all the time, never a dull moment. Actually, it was tough as hell because officers were not allowed to work. They weren't allowed to do any labour. That was, again, part of the Geneva Convention. So they sat around planning to escape, but a lot of them didn't do that either. A lot of them didn't really want to escape. A lot of them knew that escaping was going to be very dangerous and probably fail, and they might end up dead.
And they weren't compelled to escape.
No.
To attempt to escape.
No.
Were they?
There was no duty to escape.
No. One often thinks that it's the order is to escape, but that's
no, that was
true
the myth. And in fact,
yeah.
There's a character in The Great Escape who says, it's every officer's duty to escape. It was not. It was nowhere were you required to do this, but many did, and everyone, pretty much, bar one or two, was happy to contribute to the sort of escape industry, as it were, to sort of help, to act as lookouts, to manufacture, to help make disguises and so on. And that is half the fun of Colditz, is that kind of the extraordinary kind of community that built up around how to get out of the damn place. But not everybody was involved in that, and you definitely weren't required to. And indeed, by the end of the time in Colditz, the senior British officer was actively discouraging people from doing it, because by that point, you were likely to end up dead, because the whole atmosphere of the war had changed. Hitler had passed the commando order. If you were caught out of uniform in Germany, you were quite likely just to be killed. So the atmosphere gets darker and it changes over time.
Mm. The proportions of foreign officers in the prison. I mean, it starts off as quite multinational, isn't it? But then it's become solely a British prison.
British and Commonwealth.
British and Commonwealth.
British and Australian and New Zealand,
right.
And Canadian and so on.
But the French and the Dutch have proportionally quite a lot of success. I was trying to tot up the numbers.
Yes, it's quite interesting. And indeed, they totted up the numbers. Everyone, it was a kind of escapers league. It was one of the ways they got through the boredom of the day, was to kind of compete with each other. So there were alliances in theory between the nations, but like all alliances, there were also kind of great rivalries. And the Brits were, I won't say they were enraged when the French managed to carry out their first escapes, but they didn't like it very much. They thought they should be the first ones out. So they all spurred each other on. And it was, I found that fascinating, the way that sort of pre-war prejudices about other nations were carried into Colditz. And so there's an awful lot of sort of national stereotyping going on at all points of the compass around here. Everyone is sort of saying, oh, the beastly Belgians, all they ever do is lie around eating. And, it's all completely stereotyped. And the British are sort of lazy and feckless and unreliable in the eyes of the French and so on. And all of that is both good fun, but also it's also very instructive, I think, about a certain sort of view of the world that they carried into Colditz with them.
And the Poles were very popular, weren't they?
The Poles were much loved because the Poles treated the Germans with absolute disdain. I mean, although they themselves were in considerable jeopardy, because, of course, Poland was not a signatory to the Geneva Convention. And from the German point of view, they were very lucky to be in an officers' camp. So they were treated slightly differently. And the Poles were extraordinary. I mean, they were absolutely indefatigable escapers. They also brewed their own kind of booze in the attics of Colditz, which added to their popularity, I think.
There aren't many women in the story, obviously, but those that are hugely admirable roles. And there's this sort of 70-year-old Mrs. Walker, who's just... this story is extraordinary.
Isn't it? I mean, again, I got to Colditz thinking, well, this is going to be this is a book about men. But it's not, strangely. And Mrs. M, as they called her, that was her Polish name was Maskarowka, so she was known as Mrs. M. She'd married a Pole. She was from Fife. She was a doughty Scotswoman who had in fact worked for British intelligence, and she was in charge of the escape routes through Warsaw. And again, her story's never been told before because she sort of doesn't fit into the kind of narrative that we're used to. But when these soldiers got out of Colditz, as you have rightly pointed out, occasionally, but not very often did, many of them headed straight for Mrs. M, because she was the way to get you out of Poland, out of Nazi-occupied Poland. She was astonishingly brave. And she ran the escape routes, and they absolutely adored her. She became a sort of mythological figure inside Colditz. I mean, she was already in her 60s or even 70s by the time this was happening. And she would throw these sort of extraordinary sort of secret dinner parties in Warsaw, where everyone would toast the king. And, she would say, well, we're all going to get out of here. We're all going to get out of here. There's no problem, And then she went into hiding. So her own story is remarkable, yeah. She's not the only woman, though. I mean, the other one I thought was absolutely fascinating was a character called, her name was Irma Wernicke. She was a German... in the town of Colditz. She was the assistant to the dentist in Colditz. And another wonderful character called Czeko Chalupka, who was a Czech fighter pilot, a very debonair, louche character who ran the black market in Colditz, contrived to sort of start a love affair with Irma while on the train into Colditz. He met her in the carriage where he was sitting manacled with a soldier on either side, but managed to kind of flirt with her. And his way of continuing this relationship was that he would... And this may be partly myth, I don't know, but certainly he describes it, and others did too. He would chip his teeth with a rock every so often in order to be taken to the dentist in Colditz, where he would bribe the dentist to stay out of the way for a little while he had a lovely time with Irma. But Irma then turned out to be a fully committed anti-Nazi resistance operative. her father was head of the Nazi party in Colditz, in the town of Colditz, but she began supplying Checo with information about troop displacements, who was in charge of the local Nazi party, which troops were coming in, which were going out. And this was information that was of vital importance, that was being sent back in secret coded letters from Colditz back to MI6 back in London. So so there is this sort of extraordinary sort of dental spy connection at the heart of the story, with this woman at the heart of it.
It's wonderful. I love the bureaucratic setup with the escape committee for the British, and then there's an anti-escape board for the Germans. It's just fantastic. It really is. But I wondered, was there a sort of acknowledgement on the part of the Germans that we've gathered together all these disobedient officers, they're going to try to escape? So there was almost an allowance for it.
I don't know if there was an allowance exactly. I think there was again, it's a slightly sort of bureaucratic cast of mind, isn't it? That thinks, well, if we've got tricky people, what we need to do is put them in what we think is the most secure place, and then we'll have all the naughty people in the same place, and we can really intensify the security, which in truth they did. But initially, of course, Colditz was the worst possible place to try and keep prisoners, because it was an ancient 11th century Gothic castle with 700 rooms, and riddled with holes. There were tunnels in and out of it. There were secret hiding places. There were rafters. There were attics. It was actually, as Eggers himself said, this is a terrible place to try and keep prisoners. It's a much better idea to put them all in a flat space surrounded by barbed wire. That way we can keep an eye on them. So actually, Colditz, while it was a great symbol of kind of high security prison, was actually a useless place to try and keep people locked up.
I was trying to think of my favourite sort of gadget or a piece of escape equipment, and I think it was the piece of equipment, this aircraft that they built that they didn't actually use in the end. But I just could not get over how just creative all these prisoners were. It's just extraordinary.
Wasn't that extraordinary? I mean, that was towards the end. They designed and built a glider that was going to be reassembled on the roof and then literally catapulted into the air and across the river with two escapers in it. And the building of it, I mean, there's a design for it in the book, which is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, it was made out of 600 individual pieces of wood, mattress covers, soaked in porridge, which then tightened to create the sort of skin of the glider. And it was ready to fly. It was ready to go, and the war intervened and ended before it could be used. I have a slight suspicion it might well have crashed immediately on takeoff, because aerodynamically there were bits of it that were slightly unclear, I think. It might have just plummeted off the end of the roof and gone straight down. But no, I mean, it was the ingenuity. I mean, in a way, I think that was the way of dealing with the kind of sheer crushing tedium of being there, was to think of these complicated ways of getting out. And the other character that I loved was one who was not in Colditz, but was operating from London, MI9. Some of your listeners, I'm sure all of them will know of MI5 and MI6. MI9 was the escape and organisation back in London, and a particular character there, Christopher Clayton Hutton, Clutty, was the inventor of the great escape gadgetry industry, really, is what it became. And he's straight out of James Bond. He's Q, and he spends his entire life working out how to insert a compass into a walnut and then send it to Colditz, or how to secrete maps and currency in the handles of badminton rackets and have them shipped via sort of Copenhagen to London. I mean, but to Colditz. So there was a lot of stuff coming into Colditz that was intended for the escapers to use, and it became part of a kind of, in a way, it was much more than the sum of its things, if you see what I mean. It was a kind of way for the prisoners to know that the outside world was willing them to get out and doing its best to help them.
Well, it's an extraordinary story. Now, whilst I have you, and I'll put a link in all the show notes for our readers and listeners to be able to access the book. But whilst I have you, I want to talk a little bit more about some of your previous books. Sure. Because I know our listeners will be familiar with some of the stories here. First of all, I wanted to talk a little bit about Oleg Gordievsky, the subject of the spy. Him being the spy, and then the traitor being the American traitor. But Oleg Gordievsky, he's a fascinating man. I was talking to my father about him because he actually met Oleg Gordievsky when he was in the army. Gordievsky, officers in the British Army of the Rhine met him to talk a little bit about the Russian counterparts that they were dealing with. And my father asked him, what job would you want to do if you could in Britain? And Gordievsky's answer was he'd like to be the head of the BBC. Which I thought, having read it, very illuminating answer.
It would be a very different BBC, I can tell you. He would have been a fascinating appointment. He's an extraordinary man. I mean, he's still, I don't want to give it away for your readers, but he is still in the safe house that he has lived in ever since his exfiltration from Moscow. And indeed, I called him at one point during lockdown and I said, Oleg, how are you doing? I mean, I'm still in pretty regular touch with him. I said, how are you? He said, I don't know why everyone is complaining about lockdown. He said, I have been in lockdown for 35 years. And that is true. I mean, he lives a lot. He is imprisoned by his own history. He cannot leave the house. He's under very, very tight security.
He can't leave the house?
Not without his bodyguard. The bodyguard lives in the house. You know, he is behind an electronic wall of security. He is still considered to be a target. And he is a target. You know, I mean, he's well into his 80s now, but you know, he
post Skripal, I guess.
Yeah. Although in a way different from Skripal, Oleg, and I probably would say this, wouldn't I? But Oleg Gordievsky made a huge difference. I mean, Skripal was producing useful intelligence, but it was nothing like what Gordievsky had a tap straight into the heart of the Kremlin. He was not only able to tell the West what the Kremlin was doing, but he was able to tell the West, and his information was going straight to the Oval Office and straight to Downing Street. He was able to tell the West what the KGB was thinking of doing. Now, if you can do that, you have an absolute whip hand in intelligence. If you know with certainty what the enemy's about to do, you've really got him. And so Oleg is one of the very few spies in history who made a strategic difference. He really did. I mean, it's an odd thing to say because I've written so much about spies, but the spies don't always change history. Sometimes they're just fascinating. But Oleg is different. He's both fascinating and he really does materially change our history.
Yeah, he's an extraordinary man. Now, moving on to another spy who I think one could argue did change history, Kim Philby. And I wondered first, was Kim Philby and Nicholas Elliott, his great friend, is there still the repercussions of his betrayal still felt in MI6 today, do you think?
I think they are, actually. I mean, I think it is, you know, it was the source of such soul searching when it happened. I mean, MI6 could not quite believe that somebody who seemed to be in every way perfect. You know, he was a brilliant intelligence officer. He'd been to the right schools, he wore the right tie, he'd been to Cambridge, you know, he looked perfect and he behaved perfectly. He was completely invisible. Couldn't believe that one of their own could really have turned against him. And Nicholas Elliott, his great friend, was the great victim of all of that. I mean, he had been Philby's friend and close protector for 2 decades. And the discovery that the entire time he was being betrayed was shattering for him. And that's the core of that story, really. But Philby does make a difference. And it's rather ironically, in fact, one of the impacts of his escape and so on, his betrayal, was that MI6 never again recruited in the same way. Philby, not intentionally, but blew away the old school tie techniques. MI5 and MI6 do not recruit in that way anymore. It doesn't happen at the bar of whites. Come on, old chap, why don't you join the Secret Service? It's a far more professional setup than that. And that, in a way, is one of Philby's legacies. He accidentally changed the culture of British intelligence forever, and partly because this story still is a source of deep anxiety, I think. You know, and there are those within the service today who are very sensitive to the charge, and perhaps it's not even a charge, but the suggestion in my book, which I firmly believe, that Philby was effectively allowed to escape, that the door was left open for him by Nicholas Elliott because they didn't want to have a trial back in London. I mean, that much we know. They did not want Philby put on trial because that would have been cataclysmically embarrassing. So I think they were agnostic between whether or not he drank himself to death in Beirut or whether he escaped. But there are, as I say, there are still people in the service who find that thought very hard to haul on.
Well, in the afterword of your book, John le Carré writes about an interview that he conducted with Elliot, and it's very interesting because I then read the Pigeon Tunnel, which I think came out a couple of years after, and he sort of slightly expands on his afterward, where he mentions that Philby had an addiction to deceit, and I wondered if that was something that isn't that something that all spies have? They're all somehow are they addicted to deception?
I think secrecy is a sort of drug. It is highly intoxicating. It is very toxic, and it is pretty addictive. I think once you are part of a secret world, it confers the kind of ruthless opportunities for private power, really. And I think Philby himself described the KGB actually as being an elite force. And there is a sort of, particularly I think for Brits, there is a sort of clubbable element to the whole thing that is part of it that makes it very, very addictive. And I think it's a very hard thing to stop doing. I mean, once you've lived in the excitement of not being the person that you seem to be, I mean, that is in a way, it's a fantasy for everybody. Every time everyone sees a James Bond movie or indeed reads a novel, you enter into an imaginary world where you are someone else. And for spies, that is a kind of reality. They are living a double reality. We all would love to think that, we are not necessarily the people we appear to be on the outside. Well, spies take that to a kind of extreme degree. And I think David Cornwell was absolutely right about Kim Philby. I think long after the excitement of the communist ideology had worn off for him, there remained the romance and the secret excitement of knowing a little bit more than the man standing next to you in the bus queue. And that was and still is an extremely alluring and addictive sensation.
Do you think, because he wrote an autobiography, and so much has been written about Philby, and yet your book, which came out relatively recently, had more to say. Do you think there's still more to come from the Philby story?
Oh, I'm sure there is. I'm sure there's considerably more. I mean, the KGB archives on Philby have not been properly released. I mean, they were combed by a kind of pet Soviet historian who was allowed access to the bits that reflected well on the Soviet Union, but the full archive has never been found. It's there. It's huge. Agent Stanley, he was the most important spy they had in the West. No, there will undoubtedly be more to say, and that'll be absolutely fascinating. God, I'm first in line if Putin decides to open it up. This is a story that the current Russian regime is very keen on. They like the Philby story. They've just renamed another square in Moscow after Kim Philby. There's a Kim Philby museum. This is a story they like. So I would be very surprised if at some point they don't authorize another book about Philby. Now, perhaps like Philby's own book, that will be deceptive. Philby's book, My Secret War, is a brilliant, brilliant book because it is absolutely stuffed with lies, brilliant deceptions that Philby has sort of cooked up. So it purports to be a memoir. What it really is another brilliant piece of deception.
It's that addiction to deceit, isn't it? So another wonderful book of yours, Operation Mincemeat, being turned into a movie. What did you think of the film?
Well, I loved it. I'm probably the last person who could give you an objective view on that. It was a strange experience seeing what is quite a complicated story. The detail of Operation Mincemeat is really quite intense. Obviously, for a film, you have to simplify. You need to create a sort of emotional core at the heart of the story. And I think Michel Ashford, the screenwriter, and John Madden, the director, did a brilliant job of that while being faithful to the essence of the story. And what I loved about the film is that it manages to be many things at once. It is both an adventure story and a spy story and a war story, but it's also a romance, and it's a comedy. I mean, there are some very funny bits in the film, and that is also very true to the reality, because the people framing up Operation Mincemeat, this idea that you would get a dead body and equip it with false papers and a false identity and ship it ashore in Spain where the Germans would find it. The people conducting that operation knew that it was absurd. I mean, they were completely alive to the comic aspects of all of it. And they were themselves sort of frustrated novelists, most of them. So they were sort of dreaming up this plot as if they were novelists. So they created a great backstory for everybody. And the film captures that quite brilliantly, I think. It's look, I know how it ends. I probably know better than anyone else in the country how it ends. But even I find the ending still both exciting and rather moving.
Great stuff. Well, Ben, thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you, and best of luck with Colditz.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a huge pleasure.
Coming up, I've got chats with Max Hastings on the Cuban Missile Crisis, Peter Stothard on Crassus, the Roman statesman and general, played by Laurence Olivier in the Kubrick movie Spartacus. So I do hope you subscribe. Shortly, I'll be releasing a bonus episode of content to coincide with Black History Month. In the meantime, thank you and good night.